Right, well, the question is asked as to what is it that the Office of the Children's Advocate can do to treat with children who are afflicted with HIV AIDS. Well, as the Child Care and Protection Act says very clearly, it is the mandate of the Office of the Children's Advocate to ensure that the best interests and the rights of all children are protected. And that means that anybody that's below the age of 18 years is our constituent, and we have an obligation to ensure that their rights are enforced and protected. Now, children who are afflicted with HIV AIDS really form a particular part of the child community. That's a vulnerable part of the community. And we believe certainly that not only should they have access to health facilities and health care that is commensurate with their needs, but we think it's very important as well that social interventions take place. We think it's important, for example, for them to be counseled, as happens now. We also think it's important that collective counseling occurs. So it's not just counseling the child, but clearly the caregiver, the family, the extended family, the close friends who are going to assist with getting this child through this particular period of his or her life have to be collectively counseled as well, so that it is a complete kind of approach that is taken to ensuring that they're fine. In terms of what more can be done, we think that perhaps more awareness can be created. Now, what can be done if a child who has HIV AIDS is actually abused in any way or has his or her rights infringed? Well, simply put, we have three different areas, I think, that we can look at it in, which will make it very clear. If it is, for example, the child is enrolled in a school or the child is in a public health facility, for instance, and it is one of those workers or caregivers in that particular facility that breaches the right of the child. Let's say the child isn't attended to as readily. Let's say that the teacher, if it happens in a school, tells the child, I'm not dealing with you because you have AIDS, kind of a thing. Then that is something that is a negatively impacting issue on the child, which really amounts to a breach of the child's rights. And so it is the Office of the Children's Advocate whose legislative mandate it is to investigate breaches of children's rights by persons who work in public agencies. We would have to investigate that matter, and at the end of the investigation we would make the necessary recommendations that we think ought to flow in terms of treating with that particular abuse and dealing with the person who is alleged to have perpetrated that abuse. If it is, for example, that the abuse takes place within the private home, let's say there's a very frustrated grandmother or a very annoyed father who has to deal with his son, for example, who is afflicted with HIV AIDS, and he gets very hostile towards the child. He's not willing to have the child have regular meals at the home, and he basically puts the child out of the home without having much regard for how the child is nurtured or cared for. Then again, that really amounts to child neglect, child abuse, some kind of negative infringement on the rights of the child. And so the Child Development Agency, who really deals with what happens to children in private homes, in private spaces, would be charged with conducting the necessary investigation through their social workers, and they would determine whether or not the environment that the child is in is amenable to enforcing his best rights. And so, again, depending on the outcome of the investigations, certain steps would follow. The child could be removed from that environment because it's particularly hostile, or there could be a referral to the police, for example, in terms of, the father's action could amount to cruelty to children, which under the Child Care and Protection Act, Section 9, is really a criminal offense, and he could be charged for that. If it is the regular Joe Bloke, John Doe in the street, for example, who sees a child in the bus park for instance, and knows by some means that the child is afflicted by this illness and says something that is very unkind, or starts heckling the child, or starts stoning the child, for example, that again is an assault upon the child, and it is something clearly that would be a matter for the police, because it's now outside the ambit of any structured place such as the private home or a government entity. And so the police, within their discretion, would deal with the investigation of that particular situation.